Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I am so excited that you've joined us this morning because one of my favorite people in the world who's been a great influence on me is my guest, Mark Nepo. And I have learned so much from him, and he provides me so much peace and just happiness just by reading his works. I'm just thrilled with him. So aloha, Mark. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And, just by way of sharing a little bit about myself, I'm a poet, a philosopher, a long-term cancer survivor. And that has really impacted and changed how I approach everything. I think it's the poet in me that sees, and it's the philosopher in me that tries to understand what I've seen, but it's the cancer survivor in me that's committed to, well, okay, how can this be of use? How can this be of use in our lives? And as a teacher and as a writer, I share examples, not instructions. While we all have to go through similar things, no two people go through them the same way, and we have to personalize it to find a way that it will work for us.
Well, that sounds like my story of what you've done for me.
Oh.
Just to put it into perspective for you, I have had two husbands die. And with the first one who died is a wonderful guy. We had a wonderful 22 years together. And I was always busy. My life was all doing, including in his last couple of years. It was all doing with him and about him. And when he was gone, I thought, I feel like I'm worn out. I just need a little bit of a space here to figure what's next for me. And so I stayed in that kind of limbo for a while. I got back into a profession that I loved, and I was doing pretty well. And then I met my next husband, which I didn't anticipate. I hadn't planned on being married again at all. But he was an incredible man, and he really believed in living in the moment. And he taught me a whole lot, and he introduced me to you. And when we lived on the mainland before we moved to Maui, we lived in Ventura, about a mile away from the ocean. So it was always cool in the mornings. And every morning we'd go out around sunrise, and we had a chimenea so we could build a fire outside, and we'd sit around that and we'd meditate. And then we would read one chapter out of the Book of Awakening every morning.
Oh, gee.
And then discuss that. And that became kind of a thing that people knew that we did that, and they'd come and join us. And we never knew how many people were going to be there. A lot of times it was just us, and other times there were more people. And they really enjoyed whoever it was would read out loud that chapter. And I have read that book at least 5 times all the way through, one day at a time.
Oh, thank you. That's so touching. Thank you.
And yeah, it really showed me how to look at things differently, and I love that. And so I've been reading both your new books. You can see all the marks on them, because there's just so much I love, and I can apply it to my life now. And I have learned that I am being now instead of doing. And that has all been from your inspiration.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
I'm so excited to have been able to actually say that to you.
Oh, well, it's very touching. I appreciate it. You never know. We never have any idea, which also speaks to not just books and writing or things but it speaks to the very nature of kindness. Mm-hmm. That we never know what gesture, what we might think is a small thing, and how that affects and ripples into the lives of other. And so, kindness is one of the quiet medicines that we all need and we always need to keep the world going.
I love that. That kindness is did you say quiet medicine?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
quiet medicine.
I love that. That's just so beautiful. I emphasize kindness a lot in all I do. I have a group, the Grief and Happiness Alliance, that meets on Zoom every week, and we write together. And we'll take a topic like I think I'll use that one because it's really good. And just give a little brief something, and they individually write about it, and then come back together and talk about what they discovered in the process. And your book is just books, I should say, are just such a marvelous inspiration for me for all that. And I loved what you just mentioned about the stories that you teach through the stories that you tell. You just, your life must be absolutely incredible to have discovered all those stories because they're amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. I think that the stories become, before there were schools and universities, stories were how we learned.
Mm-hmm.
Stories were passed on. And stories were not, in modern times, often, or especially in the West, our stories have conclusions or morals, or they're wrapped up with a bow. But the further back we go, and the more we go to other traditions, in indigenous traditions, no, stories didn't have answers. They were ways that we shared. Look, this is as far as I got with this. Tell the story and add to it if you learn something more. And so they were never in a conclusion and all wrapped up. And I think that, the stories that I've been blessed to run across, and I share them all the time and this is what I love about teaching, is because in teaching circles, you might say something from your heart and it will call me to share a certain story in response. And they're imprinted on my heart. In our modern age, we think that to learn by the heart means to memorize. No, to learn by heart is to learn by the heart. It means that it's entered us and it's there. We don't have to remember it. We bring it forward when it's called for.
That's so beautiful. I love teaching with stories too, and I didn't really realize I was doing that so much until I was noticing you doing that in your writing. I taught writing at the university level for many years, and I would always give examples of stories, of either stories that I heard from someone else or stories that I had experienced myself, because the stories could inspire the students in a way not to write what I wrote or about what I wrote, but to discover their own stories.
Very much so, because stories speak to the heart. Muriel Rukeyser was a poet, and one of her great lines in one of her poems is, say it, say it, the universe is not made up of atoms, but stories.
Ooh, that's beautiful. Absolutely perfect. Oh, wow. My mind's just going so many different directions because I could just talk for you for hours and trying to figure out what's most important. And in Falling Down and Getting Up, you wrote about grief, and so powerful. Again, with stories and the heart of grief. That I put a big note on it saying that this is the best chapter in the book. So,
Oh, thank you, thank you.
and I just wanted to talk to you about your stories around grief, or what moved you to write about grief.
Well, I think grief and pain and fear, and I have that in the center of the book. I talk about them as the deeper teachers, and we all, just like we can't escape gravity, we all experience this. So, we live in a world that is very much afraid of these deeper teachers. And we don't have to seek them out, just like we don't have to seek out gravity. And so often in the running in fear from it, whenever we do talk about it, people who are afraid want to say, oh, don't be a downer. Do we have to be, and that's just not true in my experience. It's that it's actually healthy because no one is exempt from it. And so it's actually healthy to go through it together and to talk about it and to respond to it. One of the great stories about grief goes back to a story in the life of Buddha, where a mother had unexpectedly lost her daughter at an early age. The daughter was young. And she was just devastated. And in her tears, she went to Buddha and said, "Can you bring her back? Please, can you bring her back?" And Buddha said, "If you can find one person who hasn't experienced grief, I'll bring her back." And, it's a daunting task, but she looked, and of course she couldn't find one person. And she came back to Buddha and said in her tears, "Can you help me live with this? Can you help me live with this?" And so, I think that, of course, my own experiences of grief, with grief, have taught me, and grief can appear in so many different ways. Of course, the loss of a loved one, a person, or a pet, but we can also lose an identity and a dream and a way of being, a course where the map of life as we've known it is suddenly pulled out from under us. And so all of these things, we have to face what is so we can incorporate the grief and move on. I have I mentioned it in the book, I have a very dear friend who helped save my life when I was going through cancer many years ago. And we've been friends for 40 years. And in the last year and a half ago, he lost his wife, Linda, to a massive heart attack. And it was very difficult. And we, of course, I want to be there, and I am there for him. And in this journey together, we're learning so much together, and it's even bringing us even closer. And I think that in my experience, grief is we don't get over it. We may get under it, but we never get over it. And I think that it changes because the landscape of our life is blown up. There's a new, it's like, imagine a mountain, there's a path up it, and you have a map for that. And then grief is like, there's an avalanche, and the face of the mountain is forever different. The path you knew is no longer there. So the map that you have, no matter how dear it is, no longer works. And paradoxically, just when we don't even want to think about going back into the world, we're forced to make new maps. And we often can't do that alone. And I think another thing about grief is that it tints everything. That is, if I have a glass of water and I put a drop of iodine in it, it colors the whole glass. And in just this way, when we experience deep grief and a deep loss, it colors all of life. So, the question comes up, will there be joy again? Well, maybe, but it's not going to look the same as before, because everything has the tint of grief. Yes, there's still sunshine, but it looks different. And so does everything. And so how do we incorporate grief and move on? Years ago, I lived in Albany, New York, and in the backyard there, was there before we moved there. There were twin oaks that, huge, but twin trunks. And right through the middle of those two trunks was a piece of barbed wire, immovable because it was knit into the tree. And it's only years later that I thought of that when writing these chapters about grief, that what a teacher, because at some point those were two separate trees and there must have been a fence between them. And what the tree did was grow and incorporate the wire fence so it could not move anymore and could no longer cut. And it became a great teacher about grief, that in a strange way, all we can do is enlarge our heart to grow around the cut so it can't hurt us anymore, but it's forever there, like that piece of barbed wire in the trunk, knit into the trunk of the tree. And no one knows how to do these things. We just help each other. And that's where compassion again and kindness, compassion literally means to be with. So when I agree to be with you, I agree to be open to your pain and your joy and your confusion and you to mine. And then, we take notes about what it is to be alive and how do we do this. And no one knows, but this is where, on the one hand, no one can live your life for you, and no one can do it alone. No one can
Yes.
do it alone.
That's so beautiful. I see my path is someone like that with having two husbands die. You could think that maybe
My goodness.
you would think you're never going to be happy again. And I found by telling my story of what happened, it was really long when I first started telling it, but the more often I told it, it got shorter and shorter. And I finally got to the point where I didn't have to say it anymore. And I know that I'll grieve both of my husbands forever, and that's okay. But I've also discovered that I have been able to let go of fear. I've been able to do all the forgiveness that I could possibly think of. And I feel in kind of a fresh aspect on my life where I've been able to open up to do different things. And my purpose now is helping others deal with their grief and find happiness in the process and do that through writing. And through that, I now say I'm happier than I ever have been. And people will say, how can you do that? With the kind of grief you've got. Well, yeah, that grief is always in my heart. It's always part of my life, but it's not what controls or runs my life or dictates what I do. And what I do, like I mentioned, the Sunday writing groups, at the end of the session, every time everybody's smiling. And all these people come together to work on their grief, and to know that they're smiling at the end, I just feel like I've been instrumental in bringing some openness and some happiness into their lives by helping them tell their stories.
Well, that's wonderful. And in your sharing about how you needed to tell the story, but then after a while you didn't. And I think to go back to stories, and this is why it's so important to tell our stories and to speak our grief. Stories, we tell them until we can digest their meaning. And then we don't have to tell them anymore. And this is really, often we think, especially of elders repeating themselves because they're a lot in memory. And that's true, of course. But just as often, at any time of life, we need to tell our story more than once because there's too much to digest in one telling. And this is the purpose of telling a story. And this requires, and I learned this in a previous marriage. My in-laws, who I knew for many years, then they were farmers, and a farm couple that lived on the same farm their whole lives. And when Donald, who was my former father-in-law, and I was no longer in the marriage, but he had died, and I was now living in Michigan. But I went back to see Mary, his widow, just to see her and be with her. And so we were having tea at the farmhouse table. And she began to tell me how she, in his 80s, they were in their 80s, how she found him in his overalls on the way to the barn, and which is how he would have loved to have gone. And then we had some more tea, and then she started to tell me that again, and again, and again. And at first, I thought, oh, she's in shock, or she, doesn't, she's needing to repeat. And then I thought to myself, I have no idea. My wife Susan and I are together almost 30 years. They were together 67 years. I have no idea what it would be like to wake up one morning and have a life partner of that long, long journey not be there. And that's when I realized, no, she's And then I said to myself, I will sit here and listen to her tell that as many times as she needs to tell it, because it's too big an event to take in and digest with one telling. She was rehearsing life without him. And and this is also interesting in terms of our compassion, because I might be impatient with that telling. And I might be impatient after the sixth time. And it might be the seventh telling that has the lesson for me.
Exactly.
Yeah. So all of these things connect, that our need to listen, be with, hear ourselves, tell the stories that we have been experiencing, so that we can digest them, so we can incorporate them, and continue not turning from it all, but incorporating it and moving on.
I love that. And I love how you told about listening to other people's stories, that it's not just working through your own, it's enabling other people to tell their stories so that they can go through the process. And you learn in the meantime while you're listening to these stories.
Absolutely.
I know
Absolutely.
here in Hawaii, they have something called Talk Story, and all the Hawaiians talk story. And
Oh,
it's really neat. And I have found living in Hawaii that there's so much love, there's so much compassion, there's so much beauty in relationships, and so much genuine happiness. And I think a lot of that comes from people being able to interconnect with this talk story that they do. It's very important to them to talk story,
yeah.
and they can do it in the grocery store, wherever they happen to be, or they can be doing it sitting around in a group and sharing stories with each other. But I really think it's a lot of what brings the beauty and love and joy that people see in Hawaii, and what makes it such a magical place. There are all the
Mm.
stories.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I have come in the last few years that I like to ask folks, especially inviting parents to ask children, but just anyone that we're close to, is what's it like to be you?
Mm,
What's it like to be you? And especially when, I have a student who has a grown daughter, and her best friend committed suicide, the daughter's
mm,
friend. And, Kelly, who is my friend and student, she just was, she's a very talented, she's actually a grief counselor herself. But, it was very difficult to find a way to, her daughter was so enclosed after this. And we were talking about this in one of our circles, and I just invited her, to try asking that question. And amazingly, it just unlocked, as soon as she asked her, what's it like to be you right now? And she just opened up. She just
mm.
opened right up. And then there was a lifeline between them.
That's so beautiful. I think sometimes it's a matter of unlocking. That question is the key to unlock someone to the point where they can open up and be able to say things. Otherwise, that it's in grief, it's so easy to totally close yourself off and not
Yeah,
interact.
there's another paradox which I speak about in the book about grief, and that is, we don't, and again, we don't have to look for these things. We don't have to look for things to break us open. But that somehow when grief hits us, the very thing that breaks our heart open, something is exposed that never saw the light. And now our tears water what's first been exposed that was never exposed before. And that's a real paradox, that our tears water that place that has now been surfacing in us because of the break and the loss. My friend who I mentioned, Paul, who lost his wife, he was visiting here. He was right here in my study. I have a rocker right next to me where we spend a lot of time talking. And in, his tears, his welling up, he said, I now live in the life after tears, which is also a chapter in the book. And I really love that because, whether they're tears of joy and wonder or tears of grief, great love and great suffering are always the great teachers. And once we are open, we live in the life after tears. We are always then this close to life, which is an absolute blessing. An absolute blessing.
Something just happened when you said what you were saying. I've been asked to give a talk to people who are considering writing or doing something like that. And I had named, I'm working on putting it together right now, and I had named it Break Your Heart Open.
Oh.
And then you said it. That must be the right title for it.
That's wonderful.
Wow, that was powerful for me. It seems like sometimes in our lives, if we pay attention, there are things that influence us, inspire us, wake us up. But we got to pay attention. Got to be open so that you can have those experiences.
Well, yeah, absolutely. There's a Hindu phrase or word, upa guru, which means the teacher that is next to you at this moment. And there's always a teacher next to you at this moment. And so if we miss one, we don't have to worry. There's one right behind it. But I think when struggling in any way, I've come to practice stopping and beyond any intention or at whatsoever, and just give my full heart's attention to the nearest piece of life before me until it becomes my teacher.
Wow. That's amazing. It's just beautiful. Thank you for saying that, because it can it's so powerful. I can see being able to put that to work in my life, because it's something that I'm sure I've been experiencing through all my years, but not knowing that was what's happening to me. That those were teaching moments and things that I learned through whatever was nearest me. Beautiful. What would you say to someone? I know one of the things I love about your books, like Falling Down and Getting Up, is the suggestions at the ends of the chapter for both for conversations and for something to write about. And what would you suggest to write about to help someone deal with their grief in a positive way?
Well, I wouldn't even say positive. I would take that off.
Okay.
I would say just to meet the grief. And so I would, and then to see what that deeper teacher has to say. So the first thing I would ask is, if grief is a teacher, what would you want to ask of it? What does it want of you? What is it asking you to give and to listen for and to be with? And again, we're beyond any conclusion. Like, when we have an outcome in mind, it often blocks us from what might be there. So that's why I say, let's not label it negative or positive. Just be in conversation with grief. Be in conversation and see what it's asking of you.
Oh, wow. I love that. I'm going to write on that myself, because I can really, it just brought up so much in my mind that I could explore with that, because I don't think we think of it that way that much. So it's important.
I think we're asked to stay in conversation with life in all its aspects. And so, when we look at it that way, then how do we stay in conversation? How do we listen to and speak to the forces that are moving through us? That, and of course, one of the, archetypal truths is that what's in the way is the way. And so as much as we would like to skip over something, no, what's in the way is the way. And so we need to be present. We need to lean in. even though it's difficult. And that's often, I think life has been made just difficult enough that we need each other to ensure the journey of love.
Oh, that's so important, because that's another thing in grief, that there's so much isolation. And when you can be around, you don't have to do something for somebody else, just be with them or be there. I know some of the deepest experiences I had and the deepest grief was somebody just being there with me. We didn't have to talk.
Yeah, sure. That's so important.
Well, I could go on talking to you forever. Go page by page through all of your books, and that would just be so exciting to me.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm so grateful that you took the time to be on this podcast today, because you're going to touch a lot of hearts with this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you for what you're doing and letting me be a part of it.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Well, I strongly encourage everybody to get any of Mark's books. As I said, the Book of Awakening, that one I highly recommend, and it's really easy to read a little bit every day and just give yourself, especially first thing in the morning, it gives you something to think about, something that makes life interesting, I think. And then his new books, the Falling Down and Getting Up, and the other one is You Don't Have to Do It Alone, which is a beautiful book about friendship. They're both just great books.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, because I love what you do. You're such a gift to humanity.
Oh, well, thank you, and many blessings to you, and be well. It's great to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. And to my listeners, I can't wait to see you again next week and have some more conversations. In the meantime, write about your grief. See what comes up. And I'll see you next time. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.